A new phase of the war is unfolding in Moscow, where the state security service is directly at war with the military.
The Russian military is now fighting at Front War. The second war isn't fought with tanks or missiles, yet it's wounding Russia more deeply than Ukraine ever could. Putin's own security agency has waged a war against their own military. The FSB, Russia's modern-day KGB, is literally arresting generals, throwing them in jail, and tearing apart the very army that's supposed to win the war. In just the past 2 years, at least 19 top military officers have been arrested. That's not normal reshuffling. That's a purge, and it's happening while Russia is bleeding money, and soldiers in Ukraine with over 1 million casualties. So why is Putin letting his spy agency destroy his own military? And how is that destroying Russia? Now, this is going to be a controversial topic, and I don't care if YouTube doesn't promote it. I'm going to expose the truth anyways. Controversial topics like this one end up getting suppressed by the algorithm, except when you force the algorithm to promote it by clicking on the like button. Thank you. The FSB functions as Putin's watchdogs within the military. The FSB is basically today's version of the KGB. These people have been Putin's go-to weapon for crushing anyone who gets in his way. Since the Ukraine war started, Putin has given them some insane powers. They can arrest anyone they claim is trying to mess with the government. Pretty convenient, right? On the other side, you've got the Russian military. Over 1 million Russian soldiers are dead or wounded. The army is running out of everything: weapons, vehicles, and most importantly, good commanders. So instead of supporting his struggling military, Putin is letting his spy agency tear it apart from the inside. The inside battle started with a guy named Timur Ivanov, who was the deputy defense minister. He was arrested in April of 2024 for corruption. Everyone figured it was just Putin cleaning house because this guy was living way too fancy for someone on a government salary. No big deal, right? But then things got weird fast. 3 weeks later, they grabbed Lieutenant General Yuri Knov, who was in charge of managing staff and jobs at Russia's defense ministry. They found him with over $1 million in cash and valuables. Still, people thought this was just a follow-up drama from Putin firing his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. People thought it was just about corruption until they noticed the arrests of 2 other officers. On May 20th, 2024, they arrested 2 generals who were actually running the war in Ukraine. Major General Ivan Popov, who used to command the 58th Army, and Lieutenant General Vadim Shamiran, who was in charge of military communications. Turns out these guys were just scapegoats sacrificed to cover up the real culprit. You see, none of these arrests are about military failures in Ukraine. They're all being charged with corruption, bribery, and fraud. But here's what's actually happening behind the scenes. Each arrest follows the same patterns. Spies uncover damaging information about officers. Then they pass it to Russia's FSB to formalize the case. Vadim Shimidan, for example, worked his way up through the communications department. In the Russian military, communications people are considered the smart guys because you need serious education to do the job. They're also super close to the top commanders because they handle all the messages during battles. Russia arrested him on bribery charges, but many believe this was just to cover up the hidden bigger picture. Russia's military communications have been a disaster in Ukraine. Even Putin has complained about it publicly. So when the FSB needed a scapegoat, Shamiran was perfect. For years, they'd been holding on to secrets about him, waiting for the right time to use them. But the FSB, or I would say Putin, didn't even spare the legions. Ivan Popov is a great example. Ivan is one of the few Russian generals who fought in Chechnya, Georgia, and was sent to Crimea after Russia took it over in 2014. But in 2023, he made a huge mistake. He publicly criticized his own commanders, and someone leaked the audio. Most people thought Popov would get arrested right away, but the FSB held back. Why? Because this happened right after that mercenary leader Yena Porgo tried to march on Moscow. The last thing they needed was another military rebellion, so they waited for things to cool down, and then they grabbed him during this bigger purge. But with every arrest of an honest officer, questions could arise over these moves. Putin was already prepared, with a clever strategy to counter them. Lieutenant General Sukra Akhmedov was an officer who, unlike the others, was actually pretty terrible at his job. He commanded the 20th Combined Arms Army, which is the biggest Russian unit fighting in Ukraine. Even pro-war Russian bloggers were trashing him for being incompetent. When they fired him, some people actually supported this decision. So Russia is arresting honest officers alongside the genuinely corrupt one to make the public believe that their mistakes are the officers' fault and not the government's. The FSB isn't just going after corrupt officers. They're sending a message to every military leader in Russia. Stay in line and keep your mouth shut. This also makes sure that no one in the military gets powerful enough to challenge the supreme leader. The problem is Putin is doing this while fighting the biggest war Russia has seen since World War II. His military is already struggling with massive losses, equipment shortages, and low morale. He's also terrorizing his own officers and destroying what's left of his military leadership. This isn't just bad strategy. It's a sign that Putin's entire system is breaking down. When a dictator starts destroying his own supporters, it usually means he's running scared. The Ukraine war was supposed to make Russia look strong, but instead, it's exposing just how rotten the whole system really is. But once Apperson tried challenging the system, he was so close that it almost ended Putin's regime. This man's rebellion changed everything. Let me take you back to June 2023 when a person named Evgeny Prigozhin existed. This guy ran Wagner, Russia's most famous mercenary group. These weren't just any soldiers, they were Putin's personal military. But Prigozhin had a huge problem with Russia's military leadership, especially the defense minister Sergei Shoigu and the top general Valery Gerasimov. For months, Prigozhin had been publicly trashing these guys, calling them incompetent, and accusing them of getting his men killed for nothing. Most people thought it was just, loud complaining. But then Prigozhin did something nobody expected. He turned his army around and marched towards Moscow. Thousands of heavily armed mercenaries, rolling down Russian highways, heading straight for the capital. They took over Rostov-on-Don, which is basically Russia's military command center for the south. For a few terrifying hours, it looked like Putin might actually face aerial coup. He knew this was a do-or-die fight, but what he didn't know was the fact that the FSB knew about Prague's plan 2 days before it happened. But the FSB was helpless. 2 whole days and they still couldn't stop it. That's like knowing someone's planning to rob your house and still letting them walk through your front door. That's where Russia's neighboring ally came to its rescue. No, not China. The rebellion fell apart pretty quickly. Belarus President Lukashenko somehow talked Prigozhin into backing down, and everyone agreed to drop the charges. Prigozhin was supposed to go live quietly in Belarus. Instead, 2 months later, his plane mysteriously exploded. Funny how that works when you oppose Putin. Pogo's rebellion showed Putin that his own system was falling apart. The FSB had failed at their most basic job, protecting the regime. The military was so hated that even Putin's own mercenaries wanted it destroyed. And worst of all, it all happened while everyone was watching. So Putin did what dictators always do when they get scared. He gave the FSB more power and told them to fix the problem. The FSB got a new mission. Make sure nothing like Prigozhin's rebellion ever happens again. And their solution was simple. Destroy anyone in the military who might pose a threat. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. The FSB started using every piece of intel they had on military officers, turning routine graft investigations into weapons. Here's where Putin made a huge mistake. He launched an internal war while Russia was already fighting its biggest conflict since World War II. And that war is going insanely wild. Let me give you the real numbers here because they're absolutely staggering. In 2024 alone, Russia lost between 427,000 and 430 soldiers either killed or wounded. That's more than they lost in 2022 and 2023 combined. We're talking about losing over 1,000 soldiers every single day. To put that into perspective, Russia has lost more soldiers in 3 years of fighting Ukraine than they lost in all the wars combined since World War II ended. The Soviet war in Afghanistan lasted 10 years and killed about 15,000 Soviet soldiers. Russia is losing that many troops in Ukraine every 2 weeks. And what does Russia have to show for all of this blood? They've gained about 5,000 kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2024. That's less than 1% of Ukraine. At the current rate, Russian forces are advancing about 50 meters per day in some areas. That's slower than the deadly trench warfare of World War I. Meanwhile, Russia is bleeding equipment faster than they can replace it. Since January of 2024, they've lost over 1,000 armored vehicles, 3,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and nearly 2,000 tanks. On the other hand, Ukrainian losses are much lower. Sometimes Russia loses 5 pieces of equipment for every one Ukraine loses. Now, imagine you're a Russian general watching this disaster unfold. Your soldiers are dying by the thousands for tiny patches of muddy farmland. Your equipment is falling apart. Your supply lines are a mess. And instead of getting support from Moscow, you're watching your colleagues get dragged away in handcuffs. This is creating exactly the kind of resentment and anger that Putin fears most. The Russian military is humiliated and persecuted at the same time. Every arrest sends the same message. We don't trust you. We're watching you. And if you step out of line, you're next. But Putin's problems go way beyond just military morale. This war is bankrupting Russia. Defense spending now accounts for over 40% of the entire federal budget. The government is running out of money so fast that their budget deficit exploded by 30% in just the first half of 2024. Russia's economy, which looked surprisingly strong in 2023 and 2024, is now falling apart. The International Monetary Fund cut Russia's growth forecast from just 1.5% to 9% for 2025. Oil and gas revenues are dropping and Russia's reserve funds are practically empty after 3 years of war. This economic pressure is making the internal power struggle even worse. When there's less money to go around, everyone starts fighting over what's left. And here's the thing about corruption in Russia. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. The whole Russian government runs on graft kickbacks and stealing. For example, Russian investigators found that a supplier supplied cheap defective bearings for military transport planes. As a result, 5 Il-76 aircraft had Toby taken out of service, meaning they couldn't carry supplies to troops in Ukraine. The damage was worth about 130 million rubles, all because someone wanted to save money and pocket the difference. Stories like this happen every day in Russia. But instead of fixing the system, Putin is just shuffling the deck chairs. His new defense minister is already bringing his own network of cronies and business partners, and most likely this will result in corruption. This creates a vicious cycle. The anti-corruption purges might actually make the military less effective in the short term. Why? Because the entire system runs on personal relationships and undefeatable deals. On the other hand, Ukraine is slowly getting stronger. Western weapons are flowing in. Their soldiers are getting better training, and they're showing they can strike deep inside of Russia with drone attacks. The Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region caught Russia completely off guard and embarrassed. Putin on the world stage, but what really makes it terrifying for Russia is the fact that those arrests we talked about are not random acts. Frevin's simple corruption cleanup. This is a carefully planned takeover. The entire Russian government by Putin's spy agency. And it goes way beyond just the military. The FSB isn't just thinking about today's problems. They're planning for what happens when Putin dies or steps down. Putin is 72 years old and he won't be around forever. When he goes, there's going to be a massive fight over who controls Russia. The FSB is making sure they win that fight before it ever starts. They've identified 4 key areas they need to control. Who gets promoted in the military, how defense money gets spent, what intelligence flows to where, and who commands troops. First, personnel control. When they arrested General Knets, they didn't just remove one person. They got his files, all his records of bribes, favors, and backroom deals. And now the FSB has a complete map of military corruption. They know which officers took bribes and who owes favors to whom. That information is like having a nuclear weapon in a political fight. Now, before any military officer gets promoted, they basically need FSB approval. Second, budget control. With Russia's budget deficit exploding at 4.9 trillion rubles, that is 30% higher than planned. Control over defense spending has become crucial. The FSB positioned itself as the solution, telling Putin that the military can't be trusted with this money. Let us handle it. And that worked. Third, the intelligence takeover. The FSB is pushing into military intelligence territory, creating confusion about who reports to whom. This confusion is not accidental. When commanders are unsure which intelligence to trust, Mistakes happen. The FSB then highlights these failures, arguing why they need to take control. And fourth, they're creating a climate of total fear. Russian officers report feeling constantly watched. Phone calls monitored, activities tracked, loyalty questioned. Commanders are spending more time avoiding arrests than winning battles. The FSB has also launched a massive propaganda campaign to make this takeover look heroic. Since the war started, Russia passed laws making it a crime to spread false information about the military. These laws are so broad that any criticism can land you in jail. Hundreds have been imprisoned for peaceful protests. Foreign journalists were kicked out. Independent media was shut down. Inside this information bubble, FSB purges are presented as heroic anti-corruption efforts. People see generals getting arrested and think it's justice. They don't see the systematic dismantling of military command. The economic collapse makes this even easier. With inflation at 8.8% and the military hemorrhaging money, the FSB's pitch becomes appealing. We're efficient and loyal. Give us control and we'll fix everything. Putin, always paranoid about military coups, is happy to let his spies weaken his generals. The same military which operates inside Russia. But most of it isn't even completely under the control of Putin. This military is controlled by regional dictators. The Russian military has never been a unified force. While the FSB and military are fighting each other in Moscow, there are entire regions of Russia that operate completely different military structures from the main Russian army. And two of the most powerful are in the North Caucasus, Dagestan and Chechnya. Dagestan and Chechnya operate military forces that are structurally distinct from the core Russian military. While both regions are part of the Russian Federation, their security approaches and local military units reflect unique ethnic, political, and historical factors, especially under the leadership of Roman Kadyrov in Chechnya. Dagestan, located in the North Caucasus, has experienced repeated terror attacks and insurgency, often involving militant Islamist groups. The region's forces consist of locally recruited police, regionally secured battalions, and anti-terror units. These formations face significant mobilization pressures and disproportionate casualty rates compared to ethnic Russian regions. In recent years, Dagestan became a flashpoint for extremist attacks with coordinated shootings and bombings targeting religious and security institutions in 2024. The responses generally involve intense local counter-terror operations using armored vehicles and rapid deployment troops, with Moscow sometimes intervening directly but frequently, delegating operational control to local authorities due to the region's complexity and volatile mix of ethnic groups. Chechnya, on the other hand, is under the rule of Ramzan Kadyrov. He has deployed a personal army known as the Kadyrovsky, composed of special police units, National Guard regiments, and rapid response teams that formally report to Russian ministries, but in practice owe primary loyalty to Kadyrov himself. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Kadyrov has massively expanded his forces, roughly tripling the number of loyal military units to about 20 by the end of 2024. He claims to directly command up to 70,000 fully equipped and armed soldiers, though independent figures are likely lower. Kadyrov's units are highly centralized under his leadership, including the Akhmat Special Regiment and SOBR, Rapid Response Detachments. Many battalions are stationed in Grozny and only selectively sent to frontline operations. Newer recruits from Chechnya and other regions are more likely to serve in Ukraine. Control over regiments and police is maintained through patronage networks and loyalty to Kadyrov rather than Moscow's military hierarchy. Kadyrov's forces have faced accusations of human rights abuses and operate with considerable autonomy, often acting as enforcers for both regional and federal interests. And despite nominal integration, both Dagestan and Chechnya frequently clash with Moscow over resources, autonomy, and ethnic issues. Chechnya's expansionist ambitions have destabilized neighboring Dagestan, particularly over historical claims to border districts and ethnic settlements. Recent Chechen demands to establish control over disputed territories in Dagestan have triggered anxiety about forced expulsions and sparked ethnic confrontations, raising the risk of violence and even possible annexation efforts by Kadyrov. Moscow attempts to stay neutral in direct land disputes, but risks being compelled to intervene if unrest spreads or border adjustments become violent. Kadyrov is known for aggressive statements, one ethnic retaliation, which further inflames tensions with the North Caucasus and has led to public opposition in Ingushetia, Dagestan and North Osetia over perceived Chechen dominance. Dagestan, meanwhile, remains strategically important as a naval-based site, but persistent security threats force Russia balance direct control with local governance to prevent further destabilization amid resource challenges and economic hardship. The Russian army has always been split between different factions, rivalries, and power centers. So when they resist, it's not one organized rebellion. It's like a guerrilla warfare inside the government itself. Here's how it works. Military officers are quietly refusing to cooperate with FSB investigations. They're creating separate reporting chains that bypass the spy agency. The military is also fighting an information war against the FSB. They're leaking stories to independent media and Western intelligence about FSB corruption and overreach. Every time you see a news report about another arrested general or military dysfunction, there's a good chance it came from military sources trying to expose what's happening to them. They're also using war bloggers and patriotic commentators to criticize the FSB without directly challenging Putin. It seems like a clever strategy, but increasingly dangerous as the FSB tightens its grip on information. Some military leaders are trying to build alliances with regional governors, business leaders, and oligarchs who depend on military contracts. The idea is to create alternative power centers that can resist FSB control. But here's the problem. The FSB is going after those groups as well. With over 1 million Russian casualties in this war, and competent commanders being removed for insufficient loyalty, the military's frustration is reaching a breaking point. Officers are watching their colleagues get thrown in jail, while soldiers die for tiny gains of tiny territory. The most disturbing sign of military breakdown is what's happening to ordinary soldiers. Reports are coming out about soldiers being held in pits, basically holes in the ground, for refusing to go to the front lines. This should terrify Putin the most. All this internal conflict isn't just a distraction from the war in Ukraine, it's actually making Russia lose faster. Russia is recruiting 8,000 to 9,000 new soldiers every single month just to replace casualties. These recruits need experienced commanders to lead them, but most of these experienced commanders are sitting in FSB jail cells, arrested precisely when Russia needs competent leadership the most. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have started targeting the lifeline of Russia. Its drone strikes on Russian energy infrastructure have caused at least 60 billion rubles in damage and temporarily shut down up to 17% of Russia's refining capacity. Russia committed 40% of its 2025 federal budget to military and security services. But the budget deficit combined with FSB control over defense spending has created critical supply shortages and damaged troop morale. The FSB has seized defense contracts, prioritizing political loyalty over industrial efficiency. This has reduced weapons production quality, while foreign direct investment dropped 91% to just $3.35 billion in 2024. On the battlefield, these problems show clearly. Despite deploying 623,000 troops, up from roughly 125,000 initially, Russia captured less than 5,000 square kilometers in 2024. That's less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. And instead of fighting for their country, these soldiers are committing crimes in their own country. Russia is facing a surge in crime. Over 330,000 serious offenses were reported in the first half of 2025, which is the highest in 15 years. The surge is directly linked to tens of thousands of returning soldiers, many of whom were ex-convicts recruited from prison. Returning soldiers have killed nearly 400 people since the war began. Russian officials recognize this pattern from the post-Soviet crime spike after the Afghanistan war, when returning veterans fueled organized crime in the 1990s. The government provides no mandatory mental health assessments for soldiers returning from the front. The FSB expansion has created unprecedented domestic repression. By December of 2024, there were 783 documented political prisoners. In 2024, 1,185 people were arrested at rallies. War censorship laws introduced in March of 2022 resulted in 78 new cases in 2024 of people charged for criticizing the military. The FSB now monitors military families, defense workers, and anyone connected to the war effort. Globally, the war has seriously eroded Russia's strategic prestige. Countries in the post-Soviet spaces are exploring alternatives to Russian influence. Armenia, a traditional Russian ally, has expressed dissatisfaction with Moscow's inaction against Azerbaijan. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are deepening relations with other powers, including China and Turkey. The internal struggle is weakening Russia's ability to project power internationally, accelerating a shift towards a more multipolar world. While the world watches tanks roll across Ukrainian fields, the actual battle for Russia's future is happening in the shadows of the Kremlin. Putin's spy agency and his military are tearing each other apart, creating chaos at home and weakness abroad. This isn't just about corruption or power struggles anymore. It's about a nuclear superpower that's literally fighting itself while the world watches. And the scariest part is that we are all living with the consequences of whatever comes next.